One of the coolest things about the Arrancar arc was of course the Resurrección, and Arrancar's bankai equivalent transformation that unleashed the true form of their innate hollow power, and the fact that every single time one was released during battle it felt like a real event, no matter whether the Arrancar in question was an Espada, a Fraccion, or something else entirely. That being said, just like Bankai, just like Quincy Volstandish, not all Resurrección are created equally. Of the 32 Resurrección revealed in the canon manga then, which is the worst of the bunch? Now, when I say the worst, what do I mean? Well, today I want to try and take a more objective look at them, which is the worst from a power and ability perspective, which is ultimately the most useless or disadvantageous to the user in battle. Of course, there's always going to be some level of subjectivity to a discussion like this, but I want to examine several Resurrección that I've kind of deemed to be the worst or weakest based on how they were used in the manga and pick a so-called dubious winner from the bunch. Basically, I'm trying not to factor their designs or artistic themes into this discussion at all, though they may end up going hand in hand to some degree. So let's take a closer look at the Arrancar's Resurrección to try and determine which is the worst of them all. Before we get started, as always, consider hitting subscribe down below to help support the channel in our goal to reach 300,000 subs by the end of the year. It's only going to be possible with your help, so do consider doing so today. If you like what you see and you want to keep supporting the channel, it does mean a lot. And also, speaking of supporting the channel, check out the Patreon as well, where at the $2 tier or higher, you can get every single video of mine absolutely free of YouTube ads, while at the $1 tier or higher, you can get your name in the credits of every single video as a patron supporter. So again, a huge shout out and a massive thank you to everyone helping out over there. It is going a very, very long way. Now, before we begin, there is a little housekeeping to attend to. For the sake of fairness, I'm going to be separating out the Espada and the Fraccion, as the two aren't really comparable. What I mean is that a Fraccion's Resurrección is almost always going to look lesser or worse when placed beside an Espada's due to the different roles they play in the story. The Espada are meant to be inherently more powerful and more capable, and that of course translates into their Resurrección as well. On the other hand, as I was researching this video, it became apparent that a lot of the Fraccion release forms are much simpler and way more limited, so including that degree of separation simply made sense, or else the entire list would essentially just be made up of Fraccion. Having said that, this isn't a ranking video. I want to discuss several that I think stood out to me as being the worst overall, and then come to a conclusion of sorts. It doesn't have to be definitive at the end, and as always we'll be doing so by taking a holistic look at the Resurrección that I've included here today. What abilities do they have, if any? How do they perform in the manga? And what are the circumstances involved? As that can also play a part as well, especially in the perception of said release form. And of course, make sure to let me know down in the comments which of the Resurrección you think is the worst overall, and why. So, starting with the Espada then, and up first we have the 9th Espada Aronierro Bruheria's Glotoneria, which was also the first Espada Resurrección we ever saw. First revealed in chapter 267 with the release command Devour Her, Aronierro's Resurrección, well, it kind of just transforms his lower half into a massive eldritch octopus-like blob monster. But again, this isn't about the visuals, though I do think they're a little bit lacking, but ultimately it gets the point across. Glotoneria has the ability to consume hollows and take both their spirit energy and their individual powers, and Aronierro's release form is meant to be a visual representation of the 33,650 hollows that he's consumed throughout his life to date. And so they take on the shape of a seething, almost formless cosmic mass, and I do like the little detail of the various hollows and their masks bulging and bubbling forth from the creature's centre as if they continue to exist in there somewhere. However, the issue with Glotoneria lies mostly in Aronierro's boasting. Aronierro claims his Resurrección employs the powers of every single hollow he's consumed all at the same time, which sounds impressive on paper, and yet the best we ever see this thing do is swing a tentacle around. Now, it absolutely could be a victim of circumstance. This is the first example of that. Rukia was pretty much mentally checked out at this point of the fight and realistically wasn't strong enough to be fighting an opponent of this level. Plus, Glotoneria gets by far the least amount of time we spend with an Espada release. So, could it simply be that Aronierro didn't need to use Glotoneria to its fullest potential, or didn't even get the chance, as Rukia was so swiftly defeated after release? Possibly, but we know that Aronierro can indeed use the powers of those he devours, such as Cayenne's Nejibana or Metastasia's spiritual body fusion, so it would have at least been cool to see him utilizing abilities from the many other hollows he absorbed as well. Fighting a force of over 30,000 hollows should be terrifying, but it ultimately doesn't feel all that impressive or intimidating when all of that seems to coalesce, and yet he seems to only be capable of just whipping his tentacles around. And it kind of feels like anyone stronger than Vice Captain level would have probably wiped him out immediately. Moving on, I imagine everyone expected to see the 7th Espada Zamari LaRue's Bruheria make the list. And well, yes, it's on here. First released in chapter 300 with the command Suppress, Bruheria is much maligned among the community for a number of reasons, even discounting the release form's weird design that seems far removed from Zamari's original look and theming. Bruheria itself is just extremely limited in terms of what it can do. For starters, Bruheria actively moves away from Zamari's original theme of extreme speed and skilled footwork, and instead kind of doubles down on the voodoo witch doctor angle, focusing on control and the power to take over an opponent's limbs through the ability Amor. I've said it many times before on the channel, but when a character is defined by one singular ability, that ability is usually extremely powerful to accommodate that. Take Barragan's Respirar, for example. Amor just isn't that strong, however. Using the eyes on his body, Zamari can take control of an opponent's body part. One eye can control one limb. And if he manages to strike his opponent's head with his Amor, Zamari can then control their entire body, which is pretty good. When every eye on his body is open, Zamari commands 50 eyes total. So on the surface it doesn't sound too bad, but the reality is it is quite a stunted ability. First of all, Amor itself is actually a physical projectile, so it needs to successfully land in order to work in the first place, and Zamari seems to have pretty crazy accuracy, to be honest, but that is a consideration. Secondly, as Byakuya proves in his battle against the Espada, Amor is susceptible to being disrupted by a Shinigami's Kido, and therefore quickly becomes much easier to deal with once you know that. And while Byakuya is an extreme example, and you'll see throughout that again a lot of the perceived weaknesses of the Resurrección do come from unfortunate matchups and victims of circumstance, the reality is that Bruheria's scope just isn't big enough either. It's hard not to think that Byakuya isn't really taking the fight that seriously, and were he not concerned about Rukia's safety, he would have likely ended the battle in an instant. Because ultimately, if a captain-level opponent is bearing down upon you and you have one shot basically to hit only a single limb, you're fairly out of luck. Now, we know that Zamari can activate multiple eyes at once, so maybe he could have just tried to strike all of Byakuya's limbs immediately, but he's never shown doing that. On the plus side, Bruheria is very durable, as Zamari was able to retreat back into his Resurrección to survive a direct hit from Byakuya's Gokei, though that in itself seemed to reveal another issue with this form. Zamari's 50 eyes are very real, they are very tangible, they are exposed and vulnerable, and Gokei wipes out almost all of them in one hit, presumably rendering Amor almost useless. Look, I'll be honest, while the design does leave a lot to be desired, I don't think this is the worst Resurrección in terms of what it can do in terms of its battle capability, but I think it was worth bringing up. It's funny, when you compare Grimjo's Pantera to Lupy's Trepidora, The difference is honestly unbelievable, especially considering they were both supposed to hold the same rank of the 6th Espada at one time. But while the design of Grimjo's Pantera might leave a little to be desired again depending on who you ask, there is no doubting the form's utility, featuring a capable arsenal of abilities for both close quarters and long-range combat, even if Descaron feels a little wacky for an ultimate attack. But hell, at least Pantera has an ultimate attack. Lupy Antenor's Trepidora feels like a Fraccion release form that got upgraded to Espada status, honestly. Released with the command Strangle Them in Chapter 232, Trepidora affixes a rotational wheel to Lupy's back from which 8 long tentacles flow. The Espada can freely control the tentacles, either using them to attack individual enemies or sending all 8 of them to strike a single opponent at once. And from the tip of the tentacles, Lupy can produce a huge amount of thin spikes with which he can pierce an ensnared foe. Look, I'll be honest. On the surface, this Resurrección performs questionably well in the manga. Upon transforming, Lupy takes out Hitsugaya immediately, and then injures Rangiku, Ikkaku, and Yumichika, while fending them all off, eventually capturing them all. But let's be real, Hitsugaya is completely useless, particularly at this point in the story, so it's no surprise he's taken out the way he is, and even then he manages to use Lupy's resurrection against him in the end by freezing the arms. But there's no excuse for all 3 of these vaguely Vice Captain level Shinigami to be captured in the way they are. Of course, it is clearly just done as a setup for the arrival of Kisuke and then later the return of Hitsugaya, but still, I mean, what on earth are characters like Rangiku and Ikkaku doing specifically? I get it, Lupy is supposed to be Espada level, Trepidora is meant to be extremely quick, but did any of them even try to cut the tentacles? It just feels to me like this is a very basic and very simplistic Resurrection for supposedly again an Espada class Arrancar, and the only reason it looks as good as it does in the manga is down to the incompetence of the characters that Lupy is actually fighting, not specifically the Resurrection itself. It's no coincidence that Kisuke carves through a tentacle like it's nothing, proving that if Lupy were up against anyone of real skill in this moment, he would have been thoroughly diced up. Next up, I want to take a look at the 5th Espada, Nnoitra Gilga's Santa Theresa. Again, this is another example of, I would say, circumstance seemingly affecting the perception, though this time it's actually in Nnoitra's favour somewhat. Upon releasing his Zanpakuto in chapter 309 with the command Pray, Nnoitra gains a pair of additional arms, with all 4 of the arms now wielding enormous crescent moon-shaped scythes. Later in the fight, it's revealed that Santa Theresa is actually hiding a secret, an additional pair of arms, taking the final total up to 6, all of which again have access to their own blade. Despite Ulquiorra's later claim that he is the only Espada who focused on regeneration above all else, it's also shown that Nnoitra can freely regenerate his lost arms while in Resurrection 2 and also regrow his scythes. Again, it's pretty cool, and it fits Nnoitra well. Again, I certainly don't think this is the worst Resurrection at all. But like I said, perception is key here. Santa Theresa only really looks as effective as it does because Nnoitra happens to be fighting Kenpachi, who is himself a savage, close-quarters swordsmaster and combatant, with 0 special abilities to make use of. Simply put, this allows the 2 of them to engage in all-out war, clashing blades, slashing, hacking, and cutting away at one another. But truth be told, if Nnoitra came up against really any captain-level fighter who could actually employ some kind of special ability to go against his pretty straightforward and basic fighting style, as far as we're aware, Nnoitra's Resurrection has no protections against anything like that. He's completely bare and exposed in that sense, which again makes sense for the character, but in the wider world of Bleach it does feel quite limited. So again, this is by no means the worst Resurrection on this list, even in the Espada section, but I felt it was worth discussing all the same. Finally though, in regards to the Espada, well again, I'm sure you saw this coming a mile away, and not least because he's gigantic. It's the Zero Espada Yammy Largo's Resurrección era, released in chapter 354 with the command Get Pissed Off, which, let's face it, transforms Yammy into a huge, hulking target, even more so than he already was. Now, people think that I hate Yammy, and to be fair, I have dunked on the character a lot in the past, but that's only because some of the decisions around the character, particularly later on, warrant it. But I don't hate the character at all, actually, and I want to be fair to Yammy and acknowledge that not only does he have a special ability, but it's actually quite an interesting one, and one that seemingly has a lot more potential than maybe was allowed to be realised. It's very simple. The angrier Yammy gets, the stronger he gets, and this seems to even result in full-on new transformations too, meaning there is potentially a lot of scope to this release form. And I've said it before, but Yammy's era reads like a proto-Shrift to me in how potentially unbalanced its totally blanket ability is, but obviously in the manga, Yammy was unceremoniously killed before we could really see the fruits of that. But in regards to his actual Resurrección, well, I mean, Era doesn't really seem to do anything outside of that, save from give us a bigger, stronger, and angrier version of Yammy. He still uses all of the same moves, from Cero to Bala, fairly basic Arrancar abilities, and the only real differences found in them are that they too scale upwards to fit the newfound size. The gigantic Cero is visually impressive, but Kenpachi literally sidesteps it like it's nothing. And Kenpachi really illustrates the major issues facing Era. It's not like Era improves Yammy's inherent capabilities as a fighter, it just makes him a bigger target, which is how Kenpachi carves him up so easily. The lack of any kind of high-speed regeneration as well feels very noticeable in regards to Era, as Yammy really has just become a huge target, and can't simply regrow any body part that's destroyed. Every time he takes a major injury, he's just going to be growing weaker and weaker. Obviously, Yammy gets physically stronger and sturdier when he releases his Zanpakuto, toe, but it's not really worth bringing up because that's the same for all Arrancar. Unless it changes by an inordinate amount, we can really just consider it a universal increase across the board. So yeah, Era is very lacking, I think. It has a definite trump card in Yammy's ability to grow stronger with anger, but first of all, that's unquantifiable. And it doesn't seem like Yammy can force it to happen either. He has to be legitimately enraged, which normally means he's losing his fight anyway. And secondly, it just doesn't really gain any traction in his fight with Byakuya and Kenpachi, so yeah, this is a rough one for sure. So when it comes to the worst Resurrección among the Espada, I'm kind of going between two of them right now. I think the answer is maybe Glotoneria, though it does feel like we are missing a lot of context. Its special ability, though, it isn't innate to it. Aroniero's special ability feeds into it rather than the other way around. Glotoneria can apparently use the accumulated powers of 33,650 hollows, but we see zero evidence of that whatsoever. Instead, Aroniero just transforms into a big blob-like mess. But again, the lack of context could be simply down to the circumstances surrounding its use. Which is why I am hesitant to flat out call this the worst Resurrección among the Espada. I guess, trying to approach it from a more objective standpoint, it seems to me like Lupy's Trepidora is the worst Espada Resurrección, right? I mean, it has zero special abilities whatsoever, meaning it is operating from a pretty inherently limited standpoint from the off. It's very basic, it's very obvious as well. You can immediately see and tell everything this Resurrección has in store from you from the moment it first arrives, which again I think is pretty telling. It is kind of funny to look at all of the Espada Resurrección and take a step back and just observe the incredible gulf between them from virtually every perspective, talking about how Lupy's Trepidora gives the game away from the moment it is first revealed. It can't really do anything else. I guess the spikes, but that's the only secret it has going for it. Or, Nnoitra's arms. The 2 extra arms are the only real secret this Resurrección has going for it. And then you move along down the line somewhat, and you get to Stark, for example, and the Resurrección you get with him initially is not the full picture. Yes, he has pistols, yes, he can shoot Sero, okay, but then a few chapters later he conjures an entire army of wolf warheads, born of his own Reryoku. That's what I mean when I say there is a massive gulf. It's not quite as disparate as the gulf in Shrifts from worst to best, but it is pretty crazy all the same. Moving on to the Fraccion though, and this is where the Resurrección do become quite simplified by comparison, which is why they're not really comparable, at least if you want to be fair. Gone are the innate special abilities that even the Espada featured in this video might have. These select few Resurrección are very much the bottom of the barrel in terms of what they offer their user, which is very little. And again, these Fraccion release forms are being compared with their peers rather than with the Espada. So first up from Barragan's Fraccion we have Nerj Parduok, and his Resurrección Mammut, released with the command Trample in chapter 331. Mammut transforms Nerj into a rotund green mammoth. And that's about it. He doesn't gain any special abilities, and in fact he even admits that his Resurrección actually makes him a bit slower. Mammut, like many of the Resurrección on this list, is just your typical blanket strength and durability upgrade, and seemingly offers very little else. Although, I say that, but Mammut does allow Nerj to jump really high, I guess, and he has an extendable trunk that he can use to strike enemies from afar, so I suppose that's something? It's kind of weird though, because what real use is being able to jump extraordinarily high when you can already stand on the sky? And we've seen Nerj doing this, so it's not like he can't do it. And it's funny because Nerj survives a blow from Omaida's Gigetsuburi to the head, which we can likely credit to his Resurrección, but is then immediately killed by Geo Vega, who launches Soifon at Nerj's head instead. So maybe Mammut didn't offer that much protection after all, if we consider the fact that Gigetsuburi might have weakened Nerj's head to the point where he was then easily taken out by the next thing that struck it. That is speculation though, admittedly. Moving on, we have another of Barragan's 6 Fraccion next with Cho Neng Po, who releases his Zanpakuto Calderon with the command Breathe in chapter 326. This is another Resurrección that turns the user enormous, as Po becomes a titanic whale-like creature that towers over the fake Karakura Town battlefield. Again though, despite the size change, this is another form that's really just a simplistic power and durability upgrade, offering Po little else, while actually seemingly draining him of a significant amount of energy at the same time. Po goes so far as to admit that his Resurrección makes him feel bloated and tired, to the point where trying to crush his enemies becomes a huge pain for him. Not only that, but he seems really slow to me as well. He tries to bring down his fist upon Iba, and it takes forever to reach the vice captain, even in the manga, and to this day I have no idea why Iba doesn't just use Shunpo to get both himself and Ikkaku out of harm's way. So yeah, Po and his Calderon are another Resurrección that just feels very underwhelming to me. Again, I like the design on this thing, and making Po into a whale is pretty unique, but from the perspective of what this Resurrección can actually do, what it can offer, it feels really lacking, even in comparison to many of Poe's own contemporaries among Barragan's unit. Up next we've got another very similar Resurrección in Tesla Lindo Cruz's Veruga, which he releases in chapter 297 with the command Gore. Now, as the command implies, Veruga transforms Tesla into a massive, hulking, warthog-like warrior, which, as I've said before, I always found really disappointing. It wasn't what I was expecting from Tesla at all, and honestly just felt kinda lazy. You know, these days it reminds me of what Kubo did to Giriko, and unsurprisingly they are both cut down immediately by Kenpachi after transforming. But again, we're not here to discuss visuals. Tesla's release form just gives him enhanced physical strength, apparently, which he then uses to savagely brutalize Ichigo. I say apparently because the thing with this form is that we have no idea, truthfully, just how strong it actually makes him, because we never saw Tesla fighting in his base form, and by the time he gets to attack Ichigo, Ichigo is already near death anyway. For him to then be one-shot by Kenpachi, a Kenpachi who was wearing his eye patch and was still quite weak overall by Kenpachi standards at this point in the story, it's a pretty bad look. and doesn't speak well of the form's durability either. Finally, there are two remaining Resurrection I want to talk about. The first is Xiaolong Kufeng's Theresa, released in chapter 208 with the command Snip. It's funny looking back at Grimjo's Fraccion and seeing their Resurrection because, again, they feel so unbelievably quaint. There's a real power creep over the course of the arc, even among the Fraccion release forms, that some of these initial ones feel so bare bones by comparison. Now, I actually quite like Theresa from a design perspective, but really all it does is give Xiaolong long, blade-like fingers, with which he then proceeds to slice up Hitsugaya. But these Resurrection, of course, come with a huge caveat. Hitsugaya was only using 20% of his power at the time when facing Theresa, so anything Xiaolong achieves is immediately scrutinized. Though, to be completely honest, should a captain really be using much more than 20% of their power when fighting a Fraccion? Kenpachi slices Tesla in half immediately, while Komamura instantly kills Poe with one hit from his bankai, and I would be amazed if those lackadaisical attacks constituted much more than 20% either, really, but I guess it's just a case of them having access to 100% of their power at the time that I suppose is the crucial difference. But it's also not like Hitsugaya is only kind of struggling against Xiaolong either. The Fraccion almost kills him, slashing him across the chest numerous times and outspeeding him too. And then finally, speaking of Grimjo's Fraccion, we have Ilfort Granz, who releases his Resurrection del Toro in chapter 207 with the command Impale. Del Toro enlarges the top half of Ilfort's body and covers him in an enormous bulky armor, while transforming his mask fragment into a massive bull-shaped helmet, complete with a pair of curved horns. So in this form, Ilfort manages to run Ururu through, which, I'll be honest, I'm amazed she survives looking at these pages, even though she's obviously a special soul, but still, comparatively, this is a similar injury to what kills Sasakibe from Driscoll. Ilfort also uses his horn to smash through Renji's bankai, but again, Renji was only using 20% of his strength. This isn't like Edrad and his Volcanica, who takes on Ikkaku's bankai at full strength. No, Ilfort can't even take down a vice captain, admittedly a strong one, but a vice captain who is using only a fifth of their power. Again, this is another Fraccion release form that offers Ilfort very little outside of a generic power-up and a supposed durability increase, but even then, he's one-shot by Renji's bankai once it returns to full strength. I guess to be totally fair to these early ones, at the very least, Xiaolong and Ilfort's Resurrection change their bodies up enough to give them new options. Xiaolong, of course, gets his bladed hands, which essentially gives him access to 10 new swords, while Ilfort grows powerful horns. Meanwhile, there are other Fraccion release forms that we've talked about in this video, where they don't really gain anything at all. And so, looking at it from that perspective, I kind of feel like the worst Resurrection here is fairly obvious, and it's got to be Chonen Po's Calderon. It comes with no actual upgrades, really, and just turns him into a big, slow-moving target, a lumbering target who is using up a dramatic amount of energy, apparently. The mere act of transforming into this whale-like creature saps Poe of so much energy that he can barely be bothered to move anymore. And that, to me, seems like a pretty big drawback when it doesn't seem like he really gets much out of this, outside if he becomes a lot bigger, I guess physically stronger, I guess more durable, but again, A, that's a blanket upgrade that basically every Arrancar receives, and B, ultimately does him no good in the end anyway. Alright everyone, but that's it for today's video, looking at potentially the worst of the Arrancar Resurrection, not from a design perspective, but from a utility perspective. Which are the absolute worst, the weakest, the most disadvantageous to the user in the manga out of the 32 that we get across the series? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. How do you feel about my picks for deliberation, but also the overall worst placed winners, I guess, in the end? In the end, I went with Lupy's Trepidora and Poe's Calderon, but I'd love to get your thoughts down in the comments below, as always. Maybe I'm off base, or maybe you agree. Let me know either way. Alright everyone, once again, thank you so very much for watching. If you enjoyed today's video, do consider hitting subscribe down below. It's free, it's quick, and it's easy to do, and it does help out the channel more than you could possibly know. I'd love to reach 300,000 subs by the end of 2026, but it's only going to be possible with your help. And check out my Patreon as well. Consider supporting over there to take that support for the channel that extra step too. If you like what I do here and you want to see more just like this in the future as we hurtle towards Core 4 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime, I'd love to get your support over there as well. Again, it would mean everything. It does go a very, very long way. Alright guys, until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.